We did on 23. There were 7 classes, like I said. So it's exciting to go on. And for that matter, 24 carries the same message as 23, but 23 deals with the mitzvot aseh, the positive mitzvahs, while 24 deals with the mitzvot los aseh, the negative mitzvahs. This is the do nots, which Hashem established. Do not eat something which is not kosher. Do not engage in any other of these 365 los aseh, do not do's. So in the same spirit of the 23rd chapter, which the Alter Rebbe demonstrates the great virtue of connecting through Hashem through mitzvahs, and then even added Torah even over mitzvahs. This as opposed or in contrast to this, which is a lashon it's an expression of a pasuk, v'zelu umazeh. Also Elokim, this case, or rather, I don't know if it's a pasuk, can't remember the expression, but you have it all along in Chassidut and Kabbalah, that this is the Shasal Mitzvahs Leisaseh, the 365 do nots, negative mitzvahs, L'umat, in corresponding to the Mitzvot Aseh, the positive mitzvahs. And just like we have the positive mitzvahs of, I don't know, and towards the positive mitzvahs, which is the positive. The Alter Rebbe explained again in 23rd chapter the enormous, the unprecedented, nothing, the unlikely, the non-comparison of any connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that could ever exist in every realm in comparison to doing a mitzvah, because you connect to Hashem's limbs, and namely learning Torah. Again, if you remember, the Alter Rebbe explains the enormous virtue even of learning Torah, even over doing mitzvahs. And the Zelu Mazeh, now we can understand as well on the other side of the coin when it comes to the 365 mitzvahs leisaseh, the Iraisa, the Torah commands, and even Kol Isuri D'Rabbanan and all the rabbinic prohibitions, how distant one unfortunately removes himself, how one distances himself from the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again in levels which are non-comparable and to any other way one would think and imagine that he's distancing himself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You could run away in very, very distant places, but if you're careful with leisaseh, with the mitzvahs leisaseh, what Hashem says do not do, you're connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Still, you didn't yank yourself away, as opposed to somebody who does, wherever he may be. He would be in a place which is on its own, in a good domain, in a holy domain, but if he violates, there's no greater distance what a Jew could distance himself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When he violates, he transgresses any mitzvahs leisaseh, may be deraisa, may be derabbanan, which means a Torah command or a rabbinic command. Why? For the same reason why we said by the mitzvahs are ratzaynei, they're Hashem's ratzayn, and therefore cleave to it, because Hashem hu ratzaynim chachmasi echad, Hashem is the will, which are his mitzvahs, chachmasi, which is his Torah, are one, because that's what Hashem is. So when you connect to Torah and mitzvahs, you connect to the core essence of Hashem. When you chas v'shalom do anything which is contrary to what Hashem wants, you are distancing yourself away from the reality of God, to the extent that because everything exists, in other words, everything exists only because Hashem desires it to exist. When you place yourself in a place which is an action which is negative, the truth of the matter is, it's a question and it's a wonder why you don't expire momentarily on the spot, because everything is associated with Hashem's ratzon, with Hashem's wants, and when you do something, and again, which is this tantamount to the idea of mitzvahs, which are called ratzon shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, and if Hashem says do not do it, and you go ahead and do it, and you engage with something that Hashem says do not, so again, the question is, why don't you don't expire on the spot?
There'd be no free will then.
What?
There'd be no free will if you get punished immediately.
Free will always have.
No,
because we're not talking about.
People wouldn't do. If they saw that anybody who transgresses.
And what if you were your own?
Dies right away.
There we go. There we go. There we go. So we're dealing with. Let's say you were yourself in the world. It's not that you see the consequence because of someone else. With yourself, we have desires. The freedom of the free will we have because we have the desire. We have a taiva.
Because you'd be afraid. of immediate punishment.
There's nothing wrong with being afraid of punishment.
Immediate punishment. If you know
yes,
the punishment
immediate punishment. I hear, but it's not a matter of that. In other words, the idea of, if you think about it, if there's a consequence to the fact that 2 plus 2 is 4, doesn't change the reality 2 with 2 is 4. If it doesn't fit with certain behavior or certain approach to life, let's say that 2 plus 2 is 4, doesn't change the reality 2 plus 2 is 4. In other words, if you think what a Veda is, what a violation is, it's not just some stop and he says, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I stopped by a certain thing and I said, don't do it, and just a matter, there's nothing intrinsic of that, not doing or that engaging with that, with what I am. I just happen to stop. It's an external decision. And I stopped by that and I said, don't do it. No. Hashem says, no, this is the most dangerous place which one could ever think of going or engaging with, because neged ritzayim chachmasi, it's against the whole reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Means the question is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu set it up that we don't expire on the spot, but ideally, conceptually, because it's neged ratzin HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the flow of everything comes from Hashem's ratzin, and mitzvahs are Hashem's ratzin. When you do neged ritzayinai, so this should be, apparently, you shouldn't expire. And Al Rebbe even says later, rather in the previous chapters, that in the end of the day Hashem allows a little bit energy should flow and enter, it should come, ultimately should enter into the person even when he violates, that he should be able to continue to live and to do tshuva and so on, to hop on onto the right path. So therefore Hashem does it, but with a decision that I'm going to let the person continue in order for him to come back and to straighten himself out. But what the person's doing...
The Rabbanan does it carry the same weight as the Raisa?
Is what?
The Rabbanan.
Yes, that's what he says. It goes like this. The difference of, there's certain things of what is in the world of Chokhmah, the world of intellect, or even in the world of emotion, there's a difference between one thing and another. This makes sense that I should be bothered by this more. This makes sense I should be bothered by this less. But when it comes to Ratzain, something which is on a more of a core leveled approach to something, so then in a sense the details and the categories are swallowed in to the bigger picture of Ratzon Hashem, what Hashem wants. We find it by ourselves as well. For example, you buy a car. What's naturally most important to you is car drives nice, the interior is okay, and so on and so forth. But let's say suddenly a small something when you buy it, you're at the dealer, there's something small which it's minutia, it's maybe irrelevant, something is bent, or something which is not, doesn't look like the original what you saw in the picture. The color is off, and you think, and obviously, in wisdom, in other words, based on chokhmah, intellectually, you could always differentiate, and one does and can differentiate between things which are more crucial, more relevant, like the motor, the interior, and so on, and there's certain things which are external, and they cannot compare to one to the other. But then, if you step back and you say, Ratzin, what did I want? There's something that I wanted in this car, and therefore you see that when the Ratzin stands in a state of manifestation, then there's no real difference between this and this. I want it complete. I want it complete. And if I want it complete, I want the color to be right, and there shouldn't be a bend, there shouldn't be a scratch, and so on and so forth. So I could really also explain myself and say, hey, this is important, this is less important. But that's where the world of Chachma is. In other words, from the perspective of the rationale, that's where you can differentiate, and you ought to differentiate, and essentially there is an essential difference, relevant if you're going to differentiate or not. There is a difference between things which are more important and less important. But when I stand back and Ratzon, what do I want? I want this to look exactly like this. Similarly, Hashem himself says there's categories, right? You cannot compare a mitzvah say deiraisa or leisas a Torah violation to a Rabbanan violation. But at the end of the day, when you stand in front of this scenario of a temptation which is a Rabbanan or a deiraisa, you got to stop yourself. What does the Eibishter want me to do now? Or what does he not want me to do now? When we're dealing with mitzvahs leisas, the negative mitzvahs, we ask ourselves, does Hashem want me, or He doesn't want me to engage in this violation? From that perspective and point of view, it's irrelevant if it's a deraisa or a rabbanan, because neged ritzoni. That's what the expression is. It's contrary to Hashem's ratzon. and even contrary to Hashem's Chachma. Because He established and He says, this is things that I don't want. Certainly it reflects in reprimandation and punishment, that this is a Deiraisa has a greater punishment, a greater consequence, the Rabban has a less consequence. One causes a deeper stain in the neshama, one causes a less deeper stain in the neshama. That's all fine, and that's all true on its own level. There are different categories. But from the perspective of Ratzain, what Hashem wants, and that's the way, in the end of the day, He does not want this to be done, and that's the way we have to look at it also. We stand in front of a scenario, instead of looking D'Rabbanan Deiraisa, right now, I'm encountered, I come in face to face with a Deiraisa, I know the Eibush doesn't want it. I come in face to face with D'Rabbanan, I know the Eibush doesn't want it equally. From the perspective of Ratzin, Hashem says, I don't want you to do it. So from that perspective, they're opposite than Hashem's Ratzin. And if it's opposite than Hashem's Ratzin, they are completely separated from the oneness and the unity of Hashem b'tachlis hapirud mamosh, with the ultimate separation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, just like the forces of impurity, just like the forces of klipa. Klipa is a term, impurity, which we find in Zohar and Kabbalah. And again, the reason, if you look at klipa, literally means a shell. You look at the orange, the shell is something you throw out. The orange, the pnim, is what you deal with, you eat, you appreciate, and so on. So too, there's the klipa, the outer layer. That's the impure forces which try to cover up and try to camouflage or conceal, eclipse the truth which lies within. So that's one of the reasons why, according to Kabbalah, klipa is a term for impurity. So this, you become like the forces of impurity. When a person engages in a sin, he becomes like the forces of impurity. Like the energy which is represented by other gods. In other words, the Elohim Acherim literally means other gods, which is the idols. You become the spirit of Avodah Zarah, you become the spirit of idolatry, and you become the spirit, you are similar to the spirit of the impure forces. Because at that time Hashem is turning His face, he stands in a position of about face to you. And there's no greater distance that one could ever think of, that Hashem turns His face around and cannot look at Him in the face, because you violated, means that you went against, you did the opposite of Hashem's Ratzin. Ratzin is where Hashem is, where He wants to be. I want to be in a place where this mitzvah is done. I focus in, I project, I come in Ratzin, I'm there, I want. Heipach haratzin means, and same thing when it comes to Leisa, I want this Aveda not to be performed. I want you to overcome that temptation. I am there. I'm expressing my Ratzon to you when you do my Ratzon. But when you violate my Ratzon, I am not there. I turned about face. It's contrary to where Hashem is and what it is. So my action, I place myself in the same area like the impure forces, which are certainly not connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they're the most distant, the spirit of impurity is the most distant place from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's where I place myself, Rahman al-Islam, God forbid, when I do an Aveda. So like someone could ask, well, isn't Hashem Malay Chalhar, it's Kavaydi, Hashem is everywhere. What does it mean that Hashem is not in the same domain as me? The answer is, He's in the same domain as you. You could have two friends which could be in different continents, but the love between exists within them is beyond space and beyond time. And it's irrelevant if they're in different places. There's a connection, and there's a love, and there's affection between these two people, as opposed to two people could be in the same room, and one cannot look at the other in the eye. And when they come close to the other person, they would turn about face. And that's the fact they're in close proximity is totally irrelevant. Because if they stand in a position or a state of about face one from each other, that is the greatest distance. Ignoring or not recognizing the other person, or more than that, turning about face. I can't even look at the other person. That is the state and situation. So Hashem is everywhere, but there's no greater distance between Chas v'Shalom, the person who does an Avera, because he's doing neged ratzon, contrary to Hashem's ratzon, contrary to Hashem's desire. B'chein, and so too gimel levushi nefesh. Not only your nefesh, your soul, which was engaged in that avera, but even your together with your three garments, shemiklipas nega shabi Yisrael, which the three garments of the nefesh of the animal soul, which come from klipas nega, which we spoke about and elaborated in the previous chapter, namely in chapter 6, I believe it was, where the Alter Rebbe mentions that the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, comes from klipas noga, which is machshava dibru maisa, which is the thought, speech, and action, hamalu bashim mishasa leisa, which are invested in the 365 leisa say deiraisa v'drabanon, because the only way you can actually, God forbid, engage in a mitzvah leisa is or through thought, or through speech, or through action. These are the three garments when a person invests or a person violates.
Thought is considered to be hopefully not as.
I'm sorry.
In thought, hopefully, is not as severe as through action.
Sometimes, first of all, if Hashem, who decides what's more severe or what's not severe? Hashem says clearly in the Torah that there's certain thoughts which is prohibited a person to think. A person is not allowed to entertain his mind in things, in ideas which are immodest. For example, it's a clear Torah prohibition. Which means there's certain temptations which a person has in order to, which he would express something with speech, and certain temptations which are there to be expressed in action, and there's certain temptations which reflect when in associated with the mind, the thought. And Hashem says, do not entertain your thought with this which is prohibited. And when one chas v'shalom violates, his thought is at that moment completely yanked away from the kedusha, from the sanctity of God, from the ratzon Hashem, and it falls away into the place of the impure spirit. And similarly, when a person violates in speech, that speech could have, if he would hold himself back and not speak these prohibited words or these prohibited type of talk like lashon hara or any other speech which Torah prohibits, at that moment which he allows himself, he lets loose and he allows the speech to go into areas which are clear violations, Torah violations or rabbinic violations, the speech, the koach hadibur which he's gifted with, falls away and into the world of impurity, and it goes into the same level of the klipa and sitrach of total impurity, and similar to maisa, because that's the way, Rahman that a person can, God forbid, violate the 365 leisas, namely with thought, speech, and action. Because with your feelings, which are the nefesh or your intellect, that's not a way a person violates. So, like, you can't do a mitzvah with your intellect or with your feelings, even though to the exclusion of love and fear. But the significant majority of Torah mitzvahs are performed with thought, speech, and action, which on the surface may seem to be external. They're called levushia nefesh, garments, but as Alter Rebbe clarifies in the 4th chapter, on the surface they seem to be lower than the nefesh itself. But because that's the way a Jew connects himself with Hashem, with the Torah, with Hashem's mitzvahs, namely via his thought, speech, and action, so they connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu even more than the soul itself. And similarly, when the person chas v'shalom violates, primarily it's his thought, speech, and action. But the thought, because they're the garments through which a person can violate, like we just said, or in maisa, or in action, or in speech, or in thought. But yet, make no mistake, the garments, just like, for example, if you pull my jacket, right? If you pull my jacket to a certain direction, my hand is coming along when I'm wearing my jacket. Similarly, when the thought, speech, and action, someone's going to say, okay, my thought, speech, and action will be engaged in the Aved, and I'll leave the nefesh, the soul, at home, in the shul. Doesn't work that way. The soul is invested constantly in its own garments, which is the thought, speech, and action. So therefore, when the thought, speech, and action become impure, the core of the soul also have melubeshes bilvusheha, which are invested in their garments, in thought, speech, and action. Kula miyuchadi mamash, the soul itself, all of it together, the garments and the soul, are one b'sitra achra or klipa zu, in the sitra achra, which is an impure forces, in this klipa, which is called avodah zara. Because what's avodah zara? Idolatry. Idolatry says there's God, and we are separate. We are not involved in that God. We are separate. That's in a nutshell, what a person, God forbid, establishes and demonstrates and gets involved with, or goes to, enters in that area, which is Sitrach and Klip, which is called Avodah Zarah, because he separates himself with an absolute separation from the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem Echad, which Hashem Echad means that not only He is one as opposed to two, He is everything. And when Hashem Echad wants that everything should be aligned with Him, capital H, with Hashem, and I start messing up, so I separate myself from that Hashem Echad. So I'm similar to that Avodah Zarah. And here the Alter Rebbe comes and says a great chidush. V'lo that not only I'm on the same level of this klipa sitrachra, not only I'm on the same level of this impure forces, but I become even lower, I become secondary, and it can become subordinate to the sitrachra. I become worse and lowlier than the sitrachra itself, very much. So you think about it, the person who sins is worse and lower than the klipa and sitrachra itself. Why so? Answer: because kihi, the impure forces do not invest in the physical body. The impure forces the impure forces do not invest in a physical crass body in a way that it would have a command to do Hashem's desire and chas v'sholom violate, to do opposite than Hashem's desire. No, it doesn't. It's not invested in this crass body, and therefore, what do I know? What do I know that it's not invested? What do I gain if it's not invested in this crass body? Is to be a dasas ribaina. Even the impure forces know their master. She knows her master. Ve'ena meiredas by. She doesn't rebel in her master. Lifel pu'ula iset pu'ulasa b'mishlachas malach harayim. Lifel pu'ulasa b'mishlachas malach harayim. Shalashulei b'shlachos yishal makim baruch hu. To send its evil angels without Hashem's mandate, God forbid. Whatever the Sitra Achra does is based on that overall mandate of God. Like the famous expression, Hashem wanted the king wanted to test his son, so he sent certain people, as the Rizar says, for example, a harlot, for example, to persuade the son to. So she, as much as she's all about impurity, and her presentation is to seduce the king of the sun to also engage in impurity. So her message is all impure. But in the end of the day, she is a shliach. She is fulfilling the mandate of a king. Yeah. And in this case, the impure spirits which try to persuade the person to do the wrong, and many times they become very vicious. The person, we talk about the nisayin, the challenge that the person has when it comes to certain temptations in life. The Yetzer Hara could become very strong and very potent, and makes everything so real, and it seems like this is the core, the lowest expression of the Sitra Achra, of the impure forces, and it is a very low expression of the Sitra Achra. It tries to persuade the person to do contrary to Ratzon Hashem. It sends evil angels, and these angels hit hard, and they're called, according to Torah, they're called Malachim Eroim, which means these angels are truly vicious, as we all know it. But in the same token, this Sitra Achra, this impure spirit, is not doing anything different than its mandate from God. Go test and go persuade the person to do the wrong. So in the end of the day, it is doing what Hashem wants it to do. Similar, like Bilam said. Bilam was the counterpart, Lahavdil, of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he was the epitome of impurity, as the Gemara explains who Bilam was, even though he was a Navi, like Hashem established that the nations should not have a complaint, and they should not say, where is our prophets? Hashem can say, I'll give you a prophet also. You'll see that in the end of the day, you'll prove yourself that you don't allow yourself to live a pure life. And this is what Bilam, we know the history of Bilam, even when his dealings with the Am Yisrael, when they walked in the Midbar, he was all about persuading or presenting impurity to the Jewish people, trying to persuade the Jewish people in many different levels with the sense of immorality and impurity. So Bilam stood for that, So Bilam was the one who was the epitome, or the core, the epitome of impurity. Again, despite he's a Navi, on the contrary, he's a great person, and he prophesied many, many important prophecies regarding the ultimate times of Mashiach and in the good times of Jewish people. But it's a separate subject. Why does it come from Bilam? But in the end of the day, Bilam stands, and Bilam represents, because he's not a regular Gentile, he is someone who stands. He stands as the epitome, or like a leader in the world, or the representation of impurity. Yet this Bilam says to the messengers of Balak, I'm not going anywhere, and I won't say anything if God doesn't tell me what to say or what not to say. And in the end, Hashem orchestrated that his spirit should be really aligned with what Hashem wanted him to say. That's why he said what he said, despite that he himself, it said he hated the Jews even more than Balak. And it's when he came back to himself, he did something to persuade the Jews to sin in order, because he knew that that's what makes Hashem angry. So it says he hated the Jews more than Balak. Yet Hashem really twisted him or orchestrated that he should say positive, but he himself agreed to the messages of Balak. I can't do anything without a God. I cannot violate, I cannot do something what God does not want me to do, or I cannot not do something what God does want me to do. So so this is similar to the impure forces, and that's why the Alter Rebbe gets to this and says that when Chas v'Shalom a Jew does contrary, violates the Ratzon Hashem, he does contrary to Hashem's desire, he is worse than the spirit of impurities, because they are doing it with Hashem's mandate, and we're doing it despite Hashem's mandate. Hashem is standing there and saying, do not do so. You don't have any mandate to do so, and quite on the contrary, your mandate in life is not to do that. And I go ahead and do that, I'm worse, and I'm lowlier, than lower in level than the Klippen Sitra Achra. Even the Sitra Achra is also called Avodah Zarah, which Avodah Zarah means, again, idolatry, separation from God. So he says, if you look at the Gemara says Avodah Zarah itself, you know how they call God? They call God the God of gods. They want to consider themselves a God. But how do they call God the God of gods? Means they do not deny in that reality of that super God. They call themselves God, Hashem, God of gods, which means they consider themselves a God, but they call the Hashem God of gods as authority over them, which says to the extent they recognize the fact of Hashem's omnipresence, and they recognize the fact that Hashem is over them. Now that is incorrect. It's not aligned with the true Achdus Hashem, because from the perspective of God, there is no other gods, and not only is there other gods, there's nothing else. Ein Eid Milvad, there's nothing else other than Hashem. Hashem Echad, that Hashem's oneness pervades and is part of, or everything is part of that oneness of Hashem. So not only the person cannot consider himself a God, he shouldn't consider himself anything. Like we learned in the previous chapter, or it's in the end of this chapter, rather no, in the end of Chabez says that when you consider yourself as something, as itself is similar and tantamount to Avodah Zarah. Because Avodah Zarah also does not deny in the reality of God. It just considers itself also a God. So what's the difference? You consider yourself a God, or you recognize yourself in one degree or another. Self-recognition, self-aggrandizement is tantamount to Avodah Zarah. But so we're not going to go. That's in the end of chapter 22, which anyone can look up again in Kosher Tube or TanyaOnline.com, where you have it with the text. That is the Alter Rebbe there equates the one recognizing himself or self-aggrandizement to the idea of Avodah Zarah, because Avodah Zarah in the end of the day calls Hashem also L'Kad L'Kai, recognize Hashem, but they consider themselves as a God. And again, it's no different to be considering as a God or anything else as something, because true Achdus Hashem, oneness of Hashem, in other words, to negate totally Avodah Zarah, it's all about God, it's not about me at all. But here the Alter Rebbe is using the same Kol L'Kaya in this context, which demonstrating that someone violates the Ratzon Hashem, violates Hashem's desire, and that he's lower than the spirit of impurity, because the spirit of impurity recognizes the hand of God. They do contrary, in other words, what they do, they're messengers of God, they do something which angers Hashem, and Hashem wants the person should overcome these presentations where they present the Jew in their temptation, in their desire to persuade the Jew to do contrary to the Ratzon Hashem, to what Hashem wants. So they stand forcefully in a very ugly, their presentation is very forceful and very ugly and so on. But they all in the end of the day, they have a mandate from Hashem to do so, and therefore they recognize, even Avodah Zarah recognizes God, calls God the Lakaya. And they can't, even if they wanted to, they cannot violate, they cannot transgress Hashem's ratzon. If Hashem decides, like we said by Bilam, Hashem decided Bilam is going to speak good. That in essence he didn't want to, but Hashem decided he's going to do so. Bilam cannot, he's not going to with his decision. And that's why he says, Lo uchal, I cannot violate Hashem's ratzon. Ki yedim masigim, they know very well and they perceive Shehu, Hashem is chayusam b'kiyum, Hashem is their life and their vitality and their existence. Sheyenkim, they nourish as well. Not let's not make them chasidim, let's not make them great pious people to say, oh, they know and they only do what Hashem wants, so they stand in subordinates from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and they're very well connected to the pnimius, to the core, to the inwardness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. No, in the end of the day, they are Avodah Zarah. They nourish from the about face, Aharon, which means the very about face of God, because they don't have there's no affection of God to them. And so they recognize God, they're doing their mandate, but they still nourish from the very about face of Ratzon Ha'elyon, of the desire of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hamakif Aleim. There's no connection, there's no intimate connection with them, or something, a personal connection. Certainly not intimate connection. Hashem is not there. Hashem abhors them. Hashem despises them. Hashem is disgusted with them. But in the end of the day, they are not totally antithetical, or they don't stand in total opposition to the Ratzon Ha'elyon, to the Supreme Ratzon, and therefore, again, because they recognize Hashem is a Lakah, so therefore a connection they have, but the connection is the about face of the Ratzon Ha'elyon, only Hamakif Aleim, which hovers over them because there's no personal connection. So if they have something of a connection, so why don't they recognize the oneness of Hashem? Why do they go out there and persuade the Jew to do to do contrary to Hashem's desire? The answer is because even this bit to what they're connected to, this bit to what they're connected to, the bit of godliness to what they're connected to, it stands in a way of galus, which means it's in exile. And what's the definition of exile? Someone's incarcerated. Incarcerated means that he's locked up, and his energy is not free. When a person stands outside, let's say they use the term galus, which is exile or incarceration, so then what he stands for is free. When you're locked up, you're there. But you're locked up, and what you stand for, and your spirit is not free. If it's not free, it doesn't stand in a state of manifestation, revelation. And the same thing, the energy with the spirit of Klipa and Sitra Achra, and the impure spirits, they receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and for sure they receive because they don't do anything contrary to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a recognition, so there's an attachment, there's a connection, but the connection is only makif. And the little they receive is gullus. They cover it up, they conceal it, they eclipse that little energy. Because if they would allow that energy to be free and to express itself and to stand in a state of manifestation, they would also be subordinate to God. Subordinate in a way that their message would be a godly message. So the little they receive is galus b'seichem. Again, we'll use the same example, this example. When a person's in incarceration, he's there, but his spirits are not free, so he's not manifest. He's locked in. As opposed to when he's truly free, everything about him stands in a state of manifestation. Godliness does not stand in a state of manifestation by these impure forces. A connection they have because they can't, again, as we just said, they don't violate, and they don't do contrary to Hashem's desire. But this little connection they do have is b'chinas galus b'seichem, and therefore that allows them, because they conceal this godly reality, that allows them to consider themselves a godly force, and certainly that's a denial, that's heresy, that's denial. The oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not just recognizing that Hashem is somewhere up there, distant from me, and the energy which I have I'm going to swallow. Achdus Hashem means Hashem is everywhere, and Hashem is manifest, and Hashem is revealed, and everything is Hashem, and Hashem is everything. Menein Milvadei. And they are Avodah Zarah. They are stand with complete Kfira B'Achdusei. But one thing they do not. One thing they stop short, and that is where their connection is expressed. They do not deny completely in Hashem to say He doesn't exist. They call HaKadosh Baruch Hu God of gods. Their life and energy, which is drawn into them and enters in them. That's where they cover up and they say that's not going to be manifest, that's not going to be revealed, and therefore it gives us the ability to call ourselves a God. And therefore, because they have some connection, and they would want to stand as their own mitzius as a God, but in the end of the day, they do not completely deny in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They don't say He doesn't exist. They call Hashem Elokad Elokaya. Therefore, because of that, they never violate Hashem's desire. Whatever they do is aligned perfectly with the big boss. They consider themselves, they aggrandize themselves, they consider themselves a lakah, which is wrong, it's not true. But in the end, because they call Hashem Elokaya, they never violate, they never transgress Hashem's ratzon. As opposed to, as we're going to learn next week, when a person doesn't aveda Rahman al-Islam, not only does he align himself with the spirit of Klip and Sitra Achra, in the end of the day, he's lower and is worse because his mandate is not to do so, and he makes a choice, chas v'shalom, to do contrary to the Ratzon Hashem. That's complete denial in the reality of God, which is standing in front of you and in front of the person. Says, do not do that. It's not. I'm determined you shouldn't do that, and I say, God, I'm still going to do that. That's complete denial. Therefore, the piru, the separation from God, is even worse than the klipin sitirach. Now, I don't want to conclude this class on a note, on a bad note, and chas v'shalom saying how the person's worse, even though this is the message of this chapter. But the idea of it is, we'll look at it positive. The person would know how important it is not to violate not only a mitzvah seila, but even a drabanon, or even anything what we know that Hashem does not want us to go there. We should make sure to stay away. And chas v'shalom, we ever violated, we should know the Eibishter stands with open arms to accept us with tshuva, and to truly align ourselves with the Achdus Hashem the way it ought to be. Have a great evening.